The Quiet Occupant. He noticed it at the end of a long shift, standing in the narrow locker room with its green metal doors and the damp smell of rubber boots. The itch on his upper back came and went with the steady persistence of a leaky tap. He reached a hand over his shoulder, trying to scratch the spot just below the shoulder blade. His fingers came away warm and a little raw. It was nothing, he told himself, the kind of rash a man gets from sweat and the weight of a high-visibility vest rubbing the same patch all day. He zipped his jacket and went out to the gravel parking lot where the wind carried the sour tang of the settling ponds. Ellis worked at the water treatment plant at the edge of Barlow Pines, a small town cupped by low hills and cut up by poultry trucks on the highway. The plant sat beyond the soccer fields and the electrical substation, its squat concrete buildings dull as unbuttered bread. He maintained pumps and filters, wrote neat numbers in a binder, and walked long loops to read dials that hummed softly in the evenings. On the good days, the smell faded to a faint mineral flatness. On others, it gripped the throat and sat there, patient and rubbery, while the compressors clicked and the fluorescent fixtures buzzed. The itch was a pebble in the shoe of his attention. He scratched discreetly when no one was around, tugging his collar to get a better angle. In the tiny plant bathroom, he turned his back to the mirror and twisted, trying to see. The glass, filmed with a ghost of condensed steam, showed a shape that did not quite belong to the geometry of his shoulder. A mild, raised patch like a heat rash. He dabbed at it with a paper towel. He did not want a clinic bill. Folks in Barlow Pines went to clinics for broken bones or babies, and sometimes not even then if the truck needed a fuel pump. He drank from the break room tap, then remembered the advisory. The county had put out a notice that morning, as stiff and bland as a church bulletin, saying to boil water as a precaution while crews worked on a line breakout by the old rental cabins. He spit into the sink and rinsed his mouth with the last of a plastic bottle he found behind the microwave. He told himself he had not swallowed. He told himself the itch was old, just a heat rash, just polyester rubbing skin raw, nothing to do with any line break, and nothing to do with him. Driving home, he reached back again and hooked his fingers around the spine ridge, feeling for the raised patch through the fabric. The truck cab smelled like stale coffee and pine air freshener. The evening had that late fall grain to it, the sky neither here nor there. At stoplights, the long delay made him aware of the dull hum of the engine and the soft burr of the heater fan. And under that a noise he could not place, like someone whispering in the next room while a television played. He knew it was only the tires on the road seam, only wind finding a crack around the windshield. He turned the radio on. A talk host droned about feed prices and some county supervisor seat. He turned it off before anyone said anything certain. The whispering stopped. He told himself he had imagined it. His house was a narrow, one-level place at the fringe of town, the sort of house a man could mend by himself with plywood and paint, the sort that kept its own drafts. He set his lunch pail on the counter, and the latch made a hollow little clack that always sounded to him like a polite throat clearing. The fridge hummed and knocked once like an old chest settling its joints. He gathered the empty containers and washed them. The tap sputtered before releasing a thin stream. He caught himself and filled a pot to boil, set it on the stove, and listened to the first bubbles gather and roll like faraway traffic. On the wall above the stove hung a calendar with pictures of lakes. He refused to think about the one day of each week that was still circled in pen, the day he and Lainey used to drive to the state park with a sack of egg salad sandwiches and sit with their backs against a rock hands, hooked in a way that made all the hours feel like a plane that stretched without fences. His thumb found the raised patch again and pressed too hard. He hissed and took his hand away. He tried to forget it, and he mostly did. He ate, stacked the plate, and wiped the counter in slow strokes while the fluorescent tube over the sink flickered with its little nervous stutter. He turned on the fan to cover it. He sat in his chair. The television offered a crime show where a woman in a windbreaker solved a problem that had a neat thread through it. He let the pictures move and told himself he was watching. The itch returned at the edge of sleep like a dog scratching behind a wall. He reached back, half awake, and felt the raised skin firm under his fingers, warmer than the rest of him. He told himself not to worry. He told himself, as the clock in his head marked slow seconds, that he would check it in the morning. And the morning after that he would go to a pharmacy and buy a cream, and after that, if it persisted, he would see a doctor. He would not skip steps. He would not make a fuss. He woke before dawn, the house still as a parked car. The refrigerator compressor clicked on, and he listened like a child listening for a parent Iz's voice in the next room. He went to the bathroom and twisted to look again. The patch was as red as a fresh scrape. He poked at it, his nail faintly white against the skin, and felt a tautness that made him think of drumheads. He washed his face, lathered his hands, and when he rinsed, he tasted a metallic film, even though he had boiled water for the night. He told himself the taste was from the old pipes. The day at the plant had a worn pattern to it. He checked the influence screen, pulled out a clump of leaves and a candy wrapper, noted the pump's tiny vibrations through the wrench handle, and jotted down the readings in the binder. He moved through rooms painted the color of old paper. The fluorescent hum was steadier today. He could hear it even outside, lingering in his ears, as if something soft and insectile had taken up residence in there. He wore his earplugs because protocol said to, and because he liked the way they blunted the world. In the late afternoon, while he was reassembling a valve body, he heard something behind him that did not belong to the math of the room. It was faint, like breath moving along the edge of a glass bottle. Then it was not breath at all, but a shape of a sound, a syllable almost, as if someone had tried to say his name and swallowed the second half. He turned. The doorway was empty. The sound faded the way heat does when you step away from an engine. He waited. The compressor sighed and the fan coughed. He told himself the earplugs had made him hear his own blood. He told himself the line break meant trapped air in the pipes, and trapped air sounded like speech when you were alone long enough. That evening he stood shirtless in his bathroom. He turned his back to the mirror and angled another mirror to catch the spot under his shoulder blade. The bright light showed every old freckle, every nick his father E.S. belt had left decades ago when belts were considered instructions rather than pledges. The red patch was no longer flat. It had an outline now, subtle but definite, a curve on top and a shadowed hollow below, like ground that had begun to settle after a buried root rotted away. He leaned closer, the mirrors risking a collision. He rubbed the palm of his hand over it and felt a ridge, narrow as a pencil, running at an angle. On the ridge, there was a small rise, like the nub of a knuckle under a glove. He jerked his hand away as if the mirror had lunged. He slept badly, the itch now an ache threaded with a tiny pulse. He dreamed of leaning forward and hearing someone whisper behind him, a whisper so close it raised the hairs on his neck, and when he woke, the whisper continued for a breath before the refrigerator filled the room with its dull animal drone. On the third morning, after the itch had started to keep appointments with his attention, he heard the voice again. He was pouring water from a kettle into a glass jar to cool, the boil advisory now more habit than fear, when a sound came from behind his shoulder. Not the room, not his imagination, but from the meat of him. It was not a word exactly. It was a laugh, softened by distance, a single low chuckle that slid out and stopped, as if someone had clapped a hand over a mouth. He set the jar down too hard. Glass clinked. He did not turn, because where would he turn? The voice was with him. Instead, he went very still and listened. The kitchen clock he kept more for the sound than the time ticked on the wall like a soft metronome, and between ticks he heard the faintest rasp of a breath that was not his. He did not go to work. He called in sick, which was out of character, and left a message with the secretary saying he had picked up a stomach thing from the diner and did not aim to share. He regretted the lie even as he spoke it. He sat at the table with both hands flat on the smooth wood and tried to think in straight lines. Later he would tell himself that if he had gone to work, if he had kept the grime and other people's voices around him, he would have ridden the day like a wave, and none of this would have unfolded. Later he would know that was a story he told to stand upright. He drew water from the kettle. The steam lifted like a paper ribbon. He poured into the jar and watched bubbles run up the glass like someone else's thoughts. From his back came another sound, closer, a thin hiss, then the scratch of a syllable finding its feet. He stood and walked to the bathroom, undoing buttons, shrugging out of his shirt. He angled the mirrors again and looked. The raised area had grown by the width of a finger. The ridge had sharpened. On its left side, a depression had formed that held the light like a small bowl. He put his fingertips there and pressed lightly. The hollow fit his finger pad too well, like a place designed for pressing. The skin was not dry, it was taut and smooth and hot. Underneath, something firm slid away from pressure and then slowly returned. He pressed his ear to his shoulder, ridiculous posture, head turned and shoulder lifted like a bird at a rain barrel. He heard it then, the whisper with shape, the breath with a direction. It was not English. It was syllables cut with a rough blade, scraped raw by passage through whatever small opening it had. He felt, even more than heard, the chuckle. He jotted a note in his head to throw the shirt in the wash. The thought was a refuge. He went to the grocery on Main, where the automatic doors sighed like content animals, and the air inside was too cold on wet laundry smell. He stood in front of the pharmacy shelves and compared creams in white boxes that promised relief in cautious italic script. A small boy in a red jacket stared at him and then at the cereal display. Ellis kept one shoulder angled toward the aisle's end cap. Suddenly it seemed to him that his back had become a display other people could browse with their eyes. He picked a cream with the word soothing on it. He put it in his basket with paper towels, a jar of pickles and a bag of ice, as if ice could do anything for this that soothing could not. At the register, the scanner beeped and the clerk's movements were brisk and soft like a practiced apology. He left with a paper sack and stood in the parking lot, looking at the crack in the asphalt where grass had found a way up. He applied the cream with a steadiness that made him feel competent for a stretch of minutes. The cold of it dulled the heat. He told himself it would resolve by evening. The voice did not speak while he worked the cream in with the heel of his hand. When he finished, he wrapped a clean towel around his shoulders and sat until he was late for nothing. That night, the whisper came back. It came while he was rinsing a jar, the water running thin and noisy, the heater cycling on with its small shudder. The voice slid into the rhythm of those familiar sounds and then separated itself, threading through like a needle. It said a short sound, and then another, and then it laughed again, not unkindly, but without any trace of respect. He turned the tap off. In the stillness that followed, the voice said a sentence in a rhythm that was not his, weighted oddly, syllables that leaned too long and then tripped over one another. The accent, if a rash could have an accent, had the old-world unevenness he used to hear when the new clerk at the hardware store explained where to find masonry bits. He knew then that ignoring would not undo it. He went to the bedroom and lay on his side and put his hand on the small, warm hill his back had become. Under his palm, the ridge of the thing's brow sat like a misplaced hinge. Below it, the hollow that might one day be an eye socket pulsed with blood that was not its own. He dragged his nails lightly over the skin and felt it more acutely than he wanted. When he pressed harder, it hurt in the particular way a bruise hurts when you poke it, a bright, simple pain that asserts order. He wanted order. In the morning, he drove to the clinic after deciding he could carry the copay. The clinic building was low and pinkish like chewed gum. In the reception area, a machine in the corner made a low plastic purr, and the television displayed a daytime host selling kitchen appliances. A sign taped to the desk said that walk-ins would be seen as time permitted and that there was still a boil advisory. He watched a woman with a puffy jacket fill a paper cup at a table and set it down untouched. The waiting room had the combined smell of hand sanitizer and old carpet, and the window showed a slice of sky that would not decide. The nurse who called his name wore a patterned top with small yellow flowers. In the exam room, the paper on the table crackled under him like thin frost. He tried to explain without explaining. He mentioned a rash. He mentioned a sensation like pressure and a pulsing. He did not mention the laugh. He did not mention the feeling of a bony ridge beneath his skin, because one does not say that without deciding what one is prepared to lose in the listener's eyes. The nurse took his blood pressure and talked about seasonal dryness. And when the physician came in, a man with eyelids that made him look perennially tired, Ellis felt something in him fold down. The physician looked at the spot with a small flashlight prodded gently with gloved fingers and said that it could be a cyst, possibly an inclusion cyst, that these things happen, that the body makes small decisions without consulting the owner. He used the plural noun as if distributing responsibility among a committee. He suggested warm compresses and a topical cream, and said that if it did not improve, they could schedule a minor procedure. He used the word minor in a way that sounded like an assurance, but felt like a verdict. He handed Ellis a pamphlet and told him to drink plenty of water, boiled or bottled, until the all clear, and to avoid scratching. Ellis nodded. He thanked the man as if he had been granted a loan. He walked out feeling both relieved and duped. He wanted to believe in a cyst, the way a child believes a bandage dispenses healing. He went to his truck and sat there a while, fingers light on the steering wheel, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the dry note of a leaf trapped under a wiper blade. He realized he had not wanted the word minor. He had wanted a spell. At home, he followed instructions. He folded a towel into a square and pressed it against his back, heat seeping through until the skin felt like a warmed plate. He lay on his stomach and let the warmth sink in, eyes closed, face turned to the side so he could see the unremarkable carpet fibers and the single stray thread that made a gossamer loop. He felt almost drowsy, almost convinced he had caught the problem in time, like a stain that surrenders to soap while it is still new. The whisper came through the warmth with more articulation. It spoke a phrase that rolled and dipped. He did not understand the words, but he understood that they were words. He took his hand off the compress and the voice stopped. He put it back and it started again, softer this time, as if finding a path had made it tired. He lay there holding his breath like a swimmer and tried to separate the voice from his own mind. He failed. In the failure was a relief, because then he could file it under his own weakness and pretend to fix it with the static of the television. Days passed inside that logic. He worked, he applied compresses, he kept his house in the humble order that makes a man feel he has done what he can. He noted small changes the way a logger notes weather, not quite believing in them until the line of days makes a shape. The raised area on his back had its own temperature now, a warmth that persisted even in the morning. He noticed he slept with his shoulder hitched up and his head turned, as if to make room for someone at the edge of a bench. He kept expecting to see the pillow indented in a different way. He resisted looking. At work, the compressors that had always offered a steady companionship now grated. Their rhythm matched something in him he did not want matched. He found himself counting their cycles without meaning to, and then not counting, and then counting again, like a man trying to step on the cracks and failing. The binder lines he filled became less neat. He began to hear the other workers, as if through the shell of a big seashell, their voices filtered and round. When he took his earplugs out to test reality, the world came back in a rush that made him angry for no good reason. He swallowed a remark and felt the voice on his back stir, as if pleased. One night the voice said his name. It said it wrong, but close enough. He was in the kitchen making tea out of a bag that promised calm. Steam rose in a narrow white rope. The refrigerator hum and the tiny buzz of the fluorescent bulb over the sink joined into a household choir. Behind his shoulder, the voice shaped itself into a low syllable, and then his name in two pieces, the first stretched and the second clipped, as if it had taught itself to touch letters with the tongue it did not yet know how to use. He stood there holding the kettle in midair until his hand trembled. He set it down and waited, and the voice repeated his name, a little brighter this time, the way a child repeats a new word to feel its edges. He answered without meaning to. He said, "What?" It came out flat and rough, the kind of answer he would give to a stranger who had called his name from the far side of a parking lot. He felt the muscles under his skin around the ridge twitch, a small contraction, like the beginning of a smile. He went to the bedroom and turned off the light and lay in the dark with his hands under his neck, because he did not want them to be where they wanted to be, which was on the warm rise of his shoulder. He dreamed another dream that was not dramatic, but was heavy as wet wool. In it he stood at the plant, and the clarifier tank's surface was a perfect circle, and under the surface a face watched him with the patience of a log. He spoke to it, but his voice came out as bubbles that rose and popped without saying anything. The face did not move. The eye on the left side opened wider, and he saw that the eye was only a smooth hollow, and the hollow was his own shoulder, and the surface folded over itself like a sheet. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth. It was still night, or what passed for night in that season when the sky refused to commit. The refrigerator had stopped, and the house was so quiet he could hear the single high mosquito whine of the television electronics, even though the television was off. He slid his hand under the collar of his shirt and rested it on the warm rise, and he felt a faint vibration, regular, like the purr of a cat. The purr was not pleasant. It was a ledger entry. At the plant the next day, a laminated notice had been taped to the break room refrigerator. The boil advisory had been extended. It used phrases like an abundance of caution and provided a list of steps for residents, including letting taps run, cleaning aerators, discarding ice, and calling a hotline if discoloration persisted. A man in a trucker cap made a joke about selling bottled water, then someone else said he would buy, as long as it came with a fishing license thrown in. Ellis smiled because his face was trained to, but he looked at the bolded words and felt the voice in his back show interest, the way a dog's ear tips up at the sound of a truck door. The voice did not speak at work. It waited until he was home, until the rooms were arranged in their familiar order, until the fridge hummed and the bathroom fan made its low whoosh and the neighbor's radio bled through the drywall in a watery wash. Then it tried more words. It said his name again, cleaner now, as if the syllables had been sanded. It tried a second word he did not know. He stood very still and listened. He said, "I don't know what you want," but not out loud, because saying it out loud would be an acknowledgement that would change the air in the room. The voice answered with another soft laugh and something like a question. He kept a notepad by the kitchen phone, a habit of his mother's, and he found himself writing sounds the way one writes down a license plate after something almost happens. He wrote letters and slashes, little marks to catch the shape of what he had heard. He would look at the marks later and they would mean nothing, but the act of writing put the sounds outside his head for a time, and that was enough to make dinner. The next morning, he stood again in the bathroom with the mirrors. The raised area had changed in a way that was not subtle anymore. The outline of the forehead ridge was clear, and under it, the hollow had deepened. The skin over the hollow was not discolored, but the way the light fell into it made a shadow that did not move when he did. He traced the curve with a fingertip, and it felt like tracing the edge of a cup in the dark. On the right, a second hollow had begun, smaller, like a dimple that had gone grave. Below the bridge of this impossible architecture, a narrow protrusion had pushed up under the skin. When he touched it, his stomach turned, because it registered to his hand as a nose, and a nose did not belong there. He pressed until tears pricked, and then he stopped and stood breathing, counting breaths as if they were fence posts. He went to work and did each task a fraction too carefully. He tightened bolts with a focus that put emphasis on the feel of metal meeting metal. He wrote down readings in numerals he made deliberate and old-fashioned, with flourishes like the way his grandfather wrote numbers on scrapwood. He thought that if he could bring one thing in the world to a clean line, the other line inside him would hesitate. The voice remained quiet. He could almost feel it paying attention, withholding speech like saving a joke to tell at the right moment in a room. That evening, after the sun had dropped behind the low curve of pines that gave the town its name, the power hiccuped. It did not go out entirely. The lights dimmed for a heartbeat and then burned back a different shade, as if their filament had changed its mind. The heater cut off and restarted. The refrigerator paused and came back with a deeper hum. Ellis stood under the kitchen light and thought, "Don't," to no one. On the counter, the notepad flipped a page in the draft from the heater vent. The voice cleared its throat. It said a full sentence then, in its rubbed, raw accent. He did not understand it. There was a structure to it, though, a rise and fall, a clause and a pause. It sounded like the sort of sentence you say to someone who is carrying something heavy and has put it down on your table without asking. He felt a childish urge to pretend he had not heard. He said out loud and without planning to, "No." The word hung in the warm kitchen air like a fly. The voice replied. It said his name again, and then the word that might have meant please, or might have meant move, or might have been a name for him he did not recognize. He realized he had been standing with his hand on the counter so long that his palm had left a perfect fan of sweat. He stepped back. He made a cup of tea with boiled water and did not drink it. The skin on his back tightened, as if something inside had adjusted itself after thinking for a moment. He slept sitting up in his chair with a blanket over his shoulders. In the middle of the night, he woke to the sound of rain tapping the window in a measured patience. Under the blanket, his shoulder was very warm. The warmth sank into his spine, the way a space heater warms you unevenly, a borrowed heat. He said softly, "What do you want?" Because sometimes you had to open the door to see who was there. The voice answered with a phrase that ended with his name, and for a moment in the curve of half-sleep, he understood it not as words, but as an intention. It wanted to be turned to. It wanted attention, given in a certain angle. It wanted the accord a man gives his own reflection when he stops in front of a glass door and adjusts his collar. It wanted to be recognized as a face. He did not cry, exactly. He just sat there with the blanket over him while rain ticked like a cautious typewriter. And the refrigerator cycled, and he felt very tired in the central way that is not sleepiness, but a lowering of the beams. He remembered with an ache under the ribs that had become his familiar housemate the year before when Lainey had left. He remembered the particular way she had folded her last sweatshirt, slow and exact, as if to say that even if things had gone sideways, there was a right way to exit. He had not stood in her way. He had not shouted. He had not begged. He had felt a silence open inside him like a scraped bowl. He had filled it with work and with humming machines and with unremarkable errands. Now the silence had been offered a tenant. The next day, a man from the county came to the plant in a white truck and a bright vest. He had a clipboard and the guarded smile of someone who expects to be argued with. He stood in the office with the coffee machine and explained that the advisory would remain in place for a while longer while the line was flushed and sampling was done. He spoke in careful phrases that had been practiced. He used the word precaution often. He looked at Ellis once with a measuring glance that made Ellis think of hardware clerks again. The plant manager nodded in the slow, solemn way that makes men feel a thing has been respected. Ellis touched his back where it itched and made himself stop. He went home early under the pretext of needing to fix something at his house. He did fix something. He took the towel bar in the bathroom off the wall, spackled the old holes that had grown ragged, and remounted the bar slightly higher so the towels would not puddle on the floor. It was the kind of change that made a tiny improvement while being invisible to anyone else. He stood looking at it as if it might tell him he had done well. The voice behind his shoulder said a single dry syllable that sounded like approval. He flinched, then felt stupid for flinching at praise. He moved through the rooms like a man keeping a watch by walking the perimeter of a fence. He straightened the stack of mail with rubber-banded envelopes of bills paid and bills not yet paid. He opened the refrigerator for no reason and listened to the way the motor sounded when he closed it. He took the trash out and tied the bag with a precise twist that made the plastic squeak. The air outside had the wet bread smell that low clouds bring. In the yard, a neighbor's dog barked twice, and then there was only the distant smear of traffic. When he came back in, the voice said his name again, and then another word. The word repeated, soft and tentative, as though it were trying to set a nail with gentle taps before a final strike. He found that if he tilted his head to the left, the sound became clearer, traveling through the neck's muscles into his ear like a telephone pressed to a shoulder. He did not want clarity, he told himself. He stood straight and looked at the linoleum pattern on the kitchen floor, a fake stone that had worn subtle paths where his feet always moved. He realized that his routines had drawn a map you could read like the rings in a stump. The voice seemed to read it too. It waited in the pauses between moves. It spoke in the spaces between tasks. He went to bed with a shirt on. He lay on his stomach with a second pillow under his chest. It was not comfortable. Sleep took him in brief, sober sips. In one of those sips, he turned in his mind and found himself in the plant office at night with the lights off. Out in the pump room, a red exit sign left itself reflected in the dark glass of the control panel, playing at being a small planet. He felt the voice behind him say a word he now recognized by its shape, if not by its meaning. It felt like a word you use when you greet someone after a long time apart. He said in the dream that he had not been looking for anyone. The voice made an amused sound, and he woke with the awareness that sunlight did not yet press the blinds, that the refrigerator was silent, that the house held its breath. He got up and went to the bathroom and turned on the light with a soft plastic click. He faced the mirror and took off his shirt. He did not angle the second mirror because he knew that would make it too real. He turned his back and waited to feel the air on the skin. He lifted his right hand behind his neck and placed his fingertips on the ridge. He slid them slowly down and across until he found the hollows. He pressed there gently, not to hurt, just to know. He felt the faintest attempt at motion below the skin, not the quick dart of a muscle twitch, but a slow, thoughtful shift, as if something were aligning itself with him. He took his hand away, as if it were not his own. He sat on the edge of the tub, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. He thought of the pamphlet with the word minor, and felt, deep in the drywall of his chest, a fine crack propagate with a dry sound. Later, he stood at the kitchen sink with the kettle hissing and the window showing a slice of the neighbor S. maple, like a page half-turned. He watched the first small bubbles, but he did not turn off the burner. He watched until the bubbles stacked on one another and rolled like a small landslide. The sound filled the kitchen and made the voice seem very far away. He liked that. He stood there letting the water boil like a man standing under a train trestle for the quick roar. He turned off the flame, and the quiet that returned felt hollow and enormous. The voice rushed in, close enough to feel on his skin. It said his name, and then it said, in obvious and weirdly careful tones, the word home. He did not move. He did not answer. The refrigerator clicked on with a sound like a respectful cough. He took the kettle to the counter and poured the water into the jar. He stepped back and let the steam show him the air. He poured the rest down the drain, watched it swirl with authority. He wrapped a towel around his shoulders and went to the chair in the living room. He turned the television on mute to a channel that showed a fishing show where a man in a boat wore a hat that made him look harmless. The voice behind him shifted in tone softer now. Not the chuckle of the earlier days, but a murmur that reminded him of being a kid and hearing his parents in the next room midway through an argument. Their voices not yet snapped, only dull with fatigue. He did not want to think of his parents, and so he thought of the plant instead, of the clarifier's surface, and of how a skim arm moved around and around, drawing off the foam. He made it through that day by dividing it into tasks and not letting his eyes go slack. He ate toast and he washed the plate and he checked the mail and he tightened a cabinet hinge. He did not try to understand. He told himself that understanding was for people with extra room in their minds. He had to go to work in the morning and read dials, and that meant being a man who did not believe in strange things. He told himself this until the words wore thin. Then he slept in his chair again with the blanket over his shoulders, and in the middle of the night his back shook once, a short shiver he could not attribute to any draft. The shake carried the rhythm of a contained sob. He sat up, and the voice said, softly and with a raw tenderness that made him angry, in a way that made him feel like a son, his name and then the word home again. The next morning, the radio told him that the advisory would remain in effect until the end of the week, and that residents might notice discoloration, but that it posed no risk, according to the people who say those sorts of things. He turned the radio off. He went to work. On the way, he stopped at the diner and bought a coffee that smelled like smoke. The teenage waitress with hair the color of pennies handed it through the window with a face that was too tired for her age. He liked her for not pretending. He parked at the plant and got out and stood a minute with the coffee heat on his fingers. Inside, the manager asked him to check a strainer that had been clogging too often. He did. The wires cut into his gloves as he pulled a mat of leaves away. Water pulsed and shivered as if excited. He told himself he was becoming fanciful, and he did not want that. The voice kept quiet that day. He missed it in an angry way, the way a man misses a constant irritation when it's gone, and he has nothing to push against. He went home to a house that felt borrowed, with its clean dishes and ordered towels and notepads with slashes that looked like the work of a man planning a robbery. He took off his shirt and looked at the mirror, and then did not. He sat in his chair and turned on the television and turned the volume down so low he could barely hear the canned laughter. He stared until his eyes watered. He fell asleep and woke to the sound of the refrigerator making a little hiccup and then settling into its normal hum. The voice said his name in the dark, like a friend in a crowded bar touching your shoulder and leaning in, smiling a little, ready to say something you do not want to hear but will anyway. He said without moving, "All right." The voice answered with a slow phrase, with a cadence like comfort given on a porch. He felt the warmth at his back spread like a hand. He did not know what to make of that, and he did not try. He slept. In the morning he put on his shirt for work, and the seam across the back caught against the raised ridge, and the sensation was like dragging a comb over a tender place on the scalp. He swore softly into the empty bedroom. The voice chuckled, not unkindly and not kindly either, simply participating. Days found their shape. The voice learned his name and a handful of other sounds and used them sparingly, as if they were cigarettes it could not spare. The ridge of the brow sharpened. The hollows deepened until he could rest a fingertip in the left, and it would stay for a moment as if cupped. The nose, there was no use pretending it was not a nose, pressed a little higher. He began to walk with a slight twist to keep his shirt from rubbing. He learned to lean a shoulder against the doorframe when he stood in the hallway, so the frame took the pressure. He began to pick shirts by texture rather than color. He realized that his body had become a shared space, and the realization was like finding out a spare key to his house had been under the mat all along and was being used. On a Tuesday, the advisory lifted. A new laminated notice appeared at work with the words, "All clear." The manager said something about sampling schedules and chain of custody. The man in the bright vest did not return. Ellis went home and stood at his sink and turned the tap on and watched the water run. He held his hand under it and felt the cold that bites in the center of the palm. He lifted water to his mouth and drank. It tasted like it always did. He felt the voice on his back say a single sound of disappointment, and then a second sound that might have been resignation, but might have been something else entirely. That night, he woke to the soft scrape of a branch against the bedroom window. He lay there in the dark and felt the heat of his back and the way it radiated like a small animal under a blanket. He said very quietly, "What do you want from me?" The voice answered after a pause. It said a sentence with his name in the middle and a word at the end it had been practicing. He could not understand the sentence. The last word, though, gathered itself like a leaf funneling rain and came through with clarity. The word was almost the word see. He sat up. The room was the room. The window was the window. The air had that middle-of-the-night weight. He looked at nothing. He reached behind him and placed his palm gently over the raised features. The skin was hot and dry. Under it, tiny motions waited like fish holding a place in a current. He said, without planning, "I can't." The voice made a small sound that could have been humor or pity. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It was patient. He lay back down. He did not sleep. He listened to the refrigerator hum and then stop, to the heater kick on and then go silent, to the faint patter of something settling in the attic like mice, or the idea of mice. He thought of the clarifier's slow arm, dragging its skimmer around in tireless circles. He thought of Lainey, sitting on a bench at the park, with a paper cup of coffee, her hair pulled through the back of her cap. Her gaze turning sometimes to him and sometimes to the middle distance, where people turn their eyes when they are practicing leaving. He thought of the notepad on the kitchen counter with the slashes that meant nothing. He understood, briefly and with surprising calm, that he had been chosen not for any special reason, not because he deserved anything, but because he had the right kind of emptiness. In the thin hour that is not morning and not night, when even the highway seems to pause between trucks, the voice said his name one more time, and then said very clearly and in his own language a single word. "Listen." He lay still and did. What he heard was not words. It was the order of the house he had built by habit. It was the soft clatter of the spoon he always forgot in the sink, the slight shift of the pipe under the bathroom when the heater came on, the buzzing light that flickered twice before deciding to stay lit, the way the refrigerator sometimes knocked once and then was quiet, the click of the thermostat calling, the way the mailbox lid in wind tapped, paused, tapped again, the neighbor's radio that drifted through when the night was a certain temperature. He heard these things arranged in a pattern, not changed but framed, the way a picture is the same whether you notice it or you do not. The pattern said something like a welcome and something like a demand. It said, "I am in your house now." He did not move. He listened until the refrigerator clicked and the morning began without meaning to. At work the next day, his binder lines went slanted. He missed a reading and had to backfill from the trend on the panel. The manager raised an eyebrow that let him know he had been seen. He got through the day by holding on to tasks like handles. He drove home in a fog that made the world seem like it had been washed in milk, and the taillights ahead of him were open wounds. He turned the radio on, and then off, and then on again. He thought about stopping for dinner somewhere with other people and decided against it. He did not want to be a body among bodies. He wanted to be an empty room. In that room, he set water to boil and turned on the television without sound and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room as if the threshold were a line he could stand astride and thereby be both in and out. The voice waited. It did not speak. It radiated presence the way a person can sit in a room and not say a word, but change the air by the fact of their need. He turned the burner off and forgot to pour the water. He sat in his chair and listened to the house like a stethoscope. The voice breathed with him, learned his pace, and then set its own under it, like a harmony that knows better what the song wants. He stood finally and went to the bathroom. He took his shirt off and did not bother with the second mirror. He turned his back to the one mirror and stepped close until the top of his shoulder leaned against the cold edge of the glass. He remained there, feeling the breath on the glass begin to cloud it. He said, "I'm listening." The voice said, in that raw, borrowed way, "I am here." He closed his eyes then. The room was only breath and the soft plastic click of the switch he had not pressed. He said, though no one had asked, "All right?" The face under his skin shifted a fraction, as if adjusting for a photograph. He put his palm over the warm surface, over the ridges and hollows that had no right to be part of him and yet now were, and he pressed until the mirror squeaked lightly where his shoulder pushed it. The voice made a low sound that any creature makes when pressure at last matches its shape. In the kitchen, the kettle cooled. In the living room, the mute fisherman held up a silver fish for a camera and smiled with a politeness he did not owe the fish. Out on the road, a truck passed and its headlamps made a brief moving shadow on the ceiling that looked, if you wanted it to, like a hand waving goodbye. He smiled then, not kindly and not unkindly, simply participating, and lowered his hand, but did not take it away. The house hummed a note that had been there all along. He listened to it while the face under his skin rested against his palm, and for the first time since the itch began, he felt not comfort, but a strange equality. The day ended not with a decision, but with a posture he could hold. He held it until the light in the bathroom flickered once and steadied, and then he switched it off and let the dark do the rest. He learned how to dress around it. Soft shirts, old ones washed until the fabric forgot its own shape. He cut the tags because they scraped. He stitched the back seam of one shirt into a low curve that rode below the ridgework that would have made his father snort, but felt to him like the kind of carefulness men use when tuning a carburetor by ear. He rolled a clean towel and set it behind him in the chair to keep the pressure even. He got good at reaching over his shoulder with a palm flat and steady, not touching so much as acknowledging. Whenever he put his hand there, the warmth rose to meet him as if it had been waiting. At the plant, he made his handwriting go careful again. He sharpened pencils with a knife he kept in a drawer because the office sharpener tore the wood messy. The pencil shavings curled over his thumb like little boats. The pages in the binder took his neat lines and returned them back at him in the way paper does, patient and without comment. He took to standing in the pump room longer than the task required, listening to the low place in the machine, S voice, where a person can feel how hard it has to try. The compressors ran on their side-out cycles. The fluorescent lights held their thready note. Every sound arranged itself into meaning if he let it. He did not let it most days. He kept moving. He flushed a line, bled a filter, tightened a flange, checked a lot number against a clipboard where the numbers were arranged like a grid of fenced pastures. He ate the sandwich he had packed, nothing fancy, a deliberate blandness like a fresh sheet. He drank water he had put through a long boil and cooled in a jar. It had a taste now he could not call metallic because it was more like the taste of a word before you remember its spelling. The voice behind his shoulder pressed against the inside of his skin as if paying attention. When the jar cooled in his hand, the voice laughed once, a soft handsaw laugh, friendly only the way a recommendation can be friendly. At home, he found himself making the rooms neat in a different way. He pulled the bed a hair away from the wall so it would not squeak when he turned. He cleaned the fan cover in the bathroom with an old toothbrush until the dust gave way and the fan made a cleaner sound. He wiped the refrigerator door handle until it squeaked faint like a tennis shoe on school tile. He rearranged the notepad and the short pencil by the phone, squared to the counter's edge as if awaiting order. The face under his shoulder took these as offerings and quieted for a while after each. He learned the rhythm. The house liked to be tended. The house was how it spoke to him. Sometimes, after he had done nothing at all, the refrigerator would knock once with the soft authority of a person who needs you and knows you will come. Nights lasted longer. He did not sleep in a stretch so much as in small handfuls that fell between moments when the face said his name or laughed or tried a new word the way a hand tries a doorknob. He moved around his own kitchen carefully, keeping his shoulder angled so that if it wanted to, the face could see the room in the dull sliver of the microwave, in the black window over the sink, in the frame of the television when it was off. He caught himself doing this and stopped, and then later began again with a kind of bitter resignation. He bought a small mirror at the hardware store, one of those meant to stick on a locker or a cabinet door. He told himself he wanted it for shaving. He cleaned the patch of wall by the kitchen table with a soapy rag, stuck the mirror on, and sat with his chair turned half away as if to rest. On the glass, the room gathered itself into a shy square of grey, and the face pressed toward it from under his skin with an interest that made him breathe shallow. He did not think of souls. He had never been convinced anyway. He thought of pressure and a need to be seen. He thought of the word the voice had learned and used sometimes in a way that felt flattering and not harmless. He thought of Lainey, but only the small domestic parts, not the big mistake. The way she used to fold a dish towel in strict thirds and make a clean rectangle. The way she would run a finger along a baseboard and hold her fingertip up with a little grin to show him how much dust he had missed. The face's patient attention had a little of that in it. He found himself almost wanting to tell it when he had done something right. The plant's rhythm broke one afternoon when the big clarifier tripped a low-level alarm. The sound was not loud, only persistent, a bell that refused to change its mind. He walked out there with his clipboard under his arm and the wind pushing his jacket against him with a blank hand. The tank's surface, a calm grey circle, carried a light texture from the aerators. The skim arm moved steady as a second hand. He bent to look at the weir and saw leaves soaked to a green-brown leather, riding the lip and slow walking around, clogging the teeth until they looked like the gums of a tired mouth. He fetched a brush on a long handle and worked at the leaves. The motion and the faint bump of brush against metal sent small patterns across the surface, one on top of another, like thoughts in a crowded head. Something moved at the edge of that thought. Not the leaves, not the skim arm. A distortion like heat above a road, then gone. He held still long enough that his own breath made the only ripple. The face under his skin drew itself into a taut readiness that read to his hand, like suspense. He had the sensation of someone just behind him, standing on their toes to peer over his shoulder. He straightened and backed a step and felt the face tip forward against the pull of his muscles and settle with the reluctant patience of a passenger who must accept the driver's choices. He should have ignored that. He should have gone inside and signed the alarm out and logged the brush clearing. He did all that. He did it very precisely. He wrote the time in words in the margin to please himself. He turned the page and dated it in letters the way first graders do, the whole name of the day spelled out. He thought of the word the face kept practicing, and he wanted to take that word and set it under a glass like a bug and label it in his best hand and know it could not get out. The manager asked if he could stay for a late check because the county truck might come by with more questions. He agreed. The face on his back answered with a little surge of heat that felt like approval. After the day shift shut lights and went home, the plant took on the big, empty quiet of places that have done everything asked of them. He walked room to room with a flashlight because he preferred the small circle of light to the full glare, the same way some people prefer a booth to a table. The beam caught dust and pipe flange bolts and the edge of a sign that reminded him to secure the ladder before climbing. He sat in the office with the clipboard and the binder and the open line to the outside that the heater vents always carried when the building settled. The face murmured to itself behind his shoulder in the old way it had before language, a broken river sound. He felt tired and generous, the way you do when a child is trying very hard with a thing beyond them. He said, "Quiet, it's just me." And he did not like how relieved he sounded to his own ear. The face stilled, then breathed in, a real motion under the skin, a rise and fall that matched his own breath, but a half beat off. The offset made his chest tight. He turned his head as if listening to a bird outside. He went out into the cold because the office air felt too shared. His boots rang on the metal stairs and then muted when he hit the concrete. The sky had gone flat. The tank lights turned the clarifier S skin into a grey disc that gave back a version of the world heavy as tin. He stood at the rail as if visiting a neighbor you do not know well, but must greet when you see them. The face moved under his shoulder with that little hitch it did when it wanted to be turned. He obliged without quite meaning to, angling his body until the warm part of him, the part that had learned to say his name, faced the tank. The water accepted that regard the way a mirror accepts a face and does not care. He and the face stood there that way for a time. The skim arm pushed its silent circle. Somewhere far off, a big truck changed gears. A long descending sigh like surrender rehearsed. The face said something low into him that made the tank S surface take on the careful stillness you see in an animal before it bolts. He did not understand the words. He understood the intention, small and sticky as a breadcrumb in a throat. He said, out loud because it felt pointless to keep secrets in the open air, "All right." The word was the shape of an open palm. A breath he had not meant to hold left him slowly, and the clouds did one of their pale tricks with the light, and then nothing changed at all. On the way home, he drove without the radio. He counted lighted windows on certain streets because once he had counted them, and now he did again. He watched for the used car lot's red pennants. He saw the diner sign throwing its rectangle of gold on the wet pavement. He kept his back pressed into the seat in a way that let the face rest without rubbing. In his kitchen, the refrigerator made its clean little sigh of starting again and sounded relieved to find its own rhythm once more. He leaned a shoulder against the mirror he had stuck on the wall, an accidental intimacy. That night, instead of speaking, the face listened to his house with him. They watched together a parade of small certainties. The heater's tick, the dryer's drum turning even though he had nothing in it. The way the bathroom fan stuttered as if remembering a thing before committing to it. Days stacked and would not stay put. The advisory had passed, but a different notice went around now, not official, just a folded sheet in mailboxes about a community meeting at the township hall to discuss outages and bills and the odd tastes people had said they tasted. He looked at the paper and wanted to set it on fire for the comfort of a decisive action. He put it under the phone instead. He told himself he owed nothing to other people's complaints. He told himself he had always been the kind of man who got what was given and kept his mouth closed. He told himself so many things, they made a low tide in his head. The face took more words into its mouth and tried them gently. It did not ask a lot. It said his name and the word for home and the word for door, and sometimes what might have been the word for please, though it had a habit of using it when he could not possibly be of help. On mornings when the world left him alone, he made it a little window. He would clean the small mirror on the kitchen wall and angle it just a fraction, so that the face's warm pressure could aim and recognize some corner of the room without walking in circles for it. He felt ridiculous and evangelical at once, guiding a congregation of one to a view of a world that had little use for him. When he caught himself in the act, when he saw what he was doing, shame bit him sharply, and he would drag the mirror back to square. He stopped wanting food, unless it was the sort that asked nothing of a mouth. Toast, a banana gone spotty, a spoon of peanut butter swallowed like medicine. He boiled water and forgot it, and came back to a kettle that had grown quiet and held a little sadness. He stood sometimes with his hand on the refrigerator door handle without opening it, feeling the vibration of the motor's low work travel into his bones. The face liked that posture. It hummed something back that matched the appliance. He pressed his forehead to the cool white door and stayed until the face warmed the back of his neck and made him aware of his own body like a room too full of people. At the clinic, the minor procedure was no longer a calendar item he could pretend to schedule. The nurse left a voicemail with her careful tone, and he did not call back. And then the phone rang again with the same tone in a new shape. He was not a man who skipped obligations, and even as he let the calls go to recording, he wanted to leave himself a message explaining that he was not rude, only busy dreaming. In the glass door of the clinic, when he drove past on his way to buy salt for the front step, he saw the fluorescent lights and the tiny tree still on the receptionist's desk, from a season that had already folded its decorations away in other houses. He kept driving. He took the long way home past the site where the old cabin stood, black shapes among dry weeds, and he imagined he could feel the line of pipe underground, passing stories between tired joints. The plant called him to stay late again because a sampling kit had not arrived on time and would be coming on a truck after dark. He said yes, and felt the face's approval, not for the overtime, but for the promise of the place. He went, he sat, he walked the cool rooms, and a kind of quiet happiness found him that was not his and not completely theirs. He took a cup of coffee from the machine and let it sit until the sheen on its surface had the faint drag marks that speak of cooling. He threw it away untouched. The sampling kit did not come. The manager apologized with a terse courtesy he suspected was meant for the driver, not him. He went home with a little regret that was not for the lost hour. When the power cut out one evening, it went with the same short intake of breath and a definite no that made him think of a teacher confiscating a ball. The line of lights in the kitchen fell dark, without fanfare. The heater sighed its last warm breath and then waited like a dog told to stay. The refrigerator stopped so cleanly he felt tears catch because of how little drama there was. In the silence, the house made the tiny, settling sounds houses make, and they stacked up until they formed a rustle like paper being folded very carefully. The face used that silence, the way people use a pause in an argument, to deliver a line they've been softening on their tongue. It said his name the way a person says it when a train has pulled into the station and they are standing exactly where the door will stop. He stood at the kitchen sink because he did not know where else to put his hands. Outside the window over the sink, the dark had a live depth, as if animals he did not know were moving their shoulders. He did not turn a flashlight on. He knew where everything was. He could walk the route from kettle to far counter to chair and back with his eyes closed. The face said a sentence that had more ease in it. It borrowed his words and made a stitch between languages with them, neat and firm. It used his childhood nickname once, a name his brother had used before leaving town and leaving his name behind, a name no one here had called him in years. He put a hand to his shoulder as if to hush the face and felt the warmth there flare and then subside, like a person who does not mind your quieting hand because they were finished speaking anyway. He had thought in the beginning that this was a matter of one face and one man and one sound in one kitchen. And then, little by slow little, he understood that he was a room that had been rented by a larger need. It was not the water at the plant, not precisely, and it was not the hum of the fluorescent, though those were ways of speaking. It was the house and the route his feet had worn, and the steady government of his days pressing into a shape someone could wear. It gathered itself patiently the way lichen takes stone, and by staying alters it. He felt altered, and he did not know if he minded anymore. He tried once to tape it down. He would not have said it that way, but it is what he did. He cut strips of fabric tape and smoothed them over the ridge and the hollows, making a crosshatch like a field seen from very high. The tape held his skin taut. For a handful of hours, he moved around with the quiet relief of a tightened joint. The face spoke through the tape in a muffled line that made it seem smaller than it was. He almost believed he had taken charge. By late afternoon, the skin beneath the tape burned with a low, bright hurt that read to his nerves as a warning and then as a plea. He went to the bathroom with scissors and cut the tape away, and his skin breathed like a living thing rescued from plastic. He sat on the closed toilet lid and tried to feel foolish properly, as a penance. The face did not punish him or forgive him. It simply settled back into its occupation with the composure of an animal you have tried and failed to keep outside. The word it had been practicing came clear one night when it woke him from a narrow strip of sleep. He sat up, hands already moving to his shoulder, and the face said, with a plainness that made small hairs lift on his arms, the word surrounded by a little pause, as if to give the word a fair field. He took the vowel into his breath without meaning to. He stood and went to the bathroom and turned on the light and faced the mirror. He did not use the second mirror. He leaned his shoulder toward the glass until he could feel the cold of it through the thin mat of hair. He stood that way a while, his breath making pale crescents on the glass that closed and opened like soft mouths. In those crescents he thought he saw another crescent that did not match his pattern. He put his palm over the warm skin, and the face made a sound of relief, quiet as a door latch settling properly. The next day he pulled shirts from the closet and left them in a sad hill on the bed until the bed smelled like old cotton. He threw away the newest ones. He kept the ones that had become almost memory of cloth. He cut the neck of one so wide it slid, and he pulled it back up and it slid again. He laughed once, very short, because he could see what his life had become, and the laugh had a stretch in it like old elastic. He felt the face smile under his skin, which was a strange and private sensation, like feeling a cat smiling inside your coat. He did work like a man who might be judged on it and not on other things. He cleaned out the clog on the influence screen. He greased a bearing. He aligned a length of pipe slowly until the bolt holes matched like a faithful couple. Hands. He walked the long corridor between one room and another and rolled his shoulders in a way that did not look like rolling, but let the face ease under the cloth. No one commented. If they noticed, they filed it under private business and walked around it. This is how people allow one another to go about being altered. On an afternoon with low, thick clouds that made everything in the plant look flatter, like a drawing, he found himself at the clarifier again without planning to be there. He had not been asked. He stood at the rail and watched the slow governance of the machine and felt the face lean toward the disc as if toward its own kind. He thought, without knowing why, of the shallow lake on the calendar in his kitchen in a month he had not torn off yet. He imagined the water on that page was real enough to make a sound if you ran your thumb over it. He leaned farther than was smart. The rail's bolt heads pressed his ribs. In the grey water, he saw only a greyness that accepted everything and named nothing. His hands hurt suddenly from how hard he had gripped the bar. He let go. There are days that choose their own last act and carry you to it with all the seriousness of a funeral you cannot leave. In the deep end of one such day, rain came steady and not dramatic. He sat in his chair with the blanket and tried and failed to be of use to himself. The face pressed a sentence against his spine that had the sound of coaxing without the insult of condescension. He heard in it the call he sometimes imagined the lines under the streets made to one another when water in them moved after being still. He stood up the way a person stands in a church when it is time to sing, and they do not know the words and hope the melody will carry them. He took his keys. He did not put on a coat. He drove to the plant on empty streets. The wipers made their steady neatness. The gate at the yard edge was locked, but the small door beside it did as small doors do. It yielded to familiarity. Inside, the lights were set low to save energy and stared without blinking. He walked to the clarifier with the rain roughening the surface from above, while the works under the skin held their patient processes steady. He stood at the rail and considered how ridiculous this would appear if there was someone here to watch him. There was not. He lifted his shirt from the back of his shoulder and let the rain touch the place, and the touch startled him. The skin there felt everything like a hand that had not known it could feel so much. He put one knee on the cold concrete apron and then the other. He leaned his shoulder toward the grey disc slowly as a person approaches a skittish animal. The rain made small stars on the surface. The skim arm moved and did not judge. He leaned until the warmth of him met the cold of the world. When the skin touched the water, it was like laying a letter down on a table in just the right spot. The face made a sound he had not heard from it. The sound was not a laugh and not a word. It was a made-it move of breath. The surface took his heat and made a perfect small circle of it, and in that circle, for a thimbleful of seconds, he saw what looked back like an X-ray of desire. The low curve of a brow, the suggestion of a socket, the poised nub of a nose under the skin's sheen, seeing without eyes. He did not go further. He did not submerge. He did not offer. He did not join. He took his shoulder away and stood, and the cold ran in sheets over what he had made warm, a little cruelty he accepted as fair. Behind his back, down in the works, and up in the pipes, and along the run of the railings that held old damp in their pores, a soft answering filled the space. He had never heard so many low machines say so much. He listened with a dread that had no story to hang on. He turned his damp collar up with a practical hand and walked back to the office, where he stripped his shirt off and held it under the hand dryer until it went from wet to merely heavy. An alarm he had not set for himself went off in a part of his thinking he kept for practicalities. He considered what he had done, and he saw that he had done nothing at all by the measure other people use, nothing to draw a circle around, nothing to be asked about. He did not call anyone. He went home. The face on his back was quiet and full, like a person who has just eaten the meal they had been craving for a long time and now only wishes to sit and digest with someone nearby. He slept the way a person sleeps in sick rooms, in gusts. He woke to the sound of the heater resuming normal service. He spooned cold beans from a can and put the can in the fridge as if saving a conversation. He heard the neighbor's dog give one sharp bark and then decide the matter unworthy. In the late cut-off of that day, he went to the park he had avoided because he did not want to walk his bruised heart past places it remembered. He went anyway because the face said his name and said the word home twice, with a small lift in the second that could have been hope or a warning. The manager told him to take a few days because he'd been covering extra and the county was quiet for once. The face took that in and said his name with approval, tinged by a suggestion. It wanted hours. He had hours. He dragged a chair into the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, where he could see the small mirror on the wall and the television turned off and the window over the sink that was now only a square of light and dark no view. He sat and let the face direct his posture. He turned when it wanted and held when it said hold, and went very still when it was thinking, which was often. He discovered he could fall asleep while doing that, in small drops, waking to find that the face had not moved, and the house had not scolded him for being less than vigilant. There was a knock on his door one morning, in a slot of light that looked like a promise of warmth and was not. He sat with his hands on his knees and did not rise. The knock came again and then moved away. A flyer slid under the jamb and lay on the floor with its bright rectangles. He looked at it from his chair. It carried words about a hearing at the hall regarding rates and service and complaints, sponsored by those who use the language of fairness with a zeal that often means they intend to spend it all on themselves. He put a foot out and pulled the paper towards him like a fish caught by its mouth, folded it and set it on the table face down. He heard the face breathe out a small opinion that was not contempt and not interest. He felt himself in the space between those. The clinic called again. He erased the message without playing it all the way. He thought of going, and then imagined explaining and laughed once, a single pop like a jar opening. He did not want to be touched by anyone else with that bright room smell attached to their hands. He did not want to be told words that meant something, and did not. He did not want to undo the shape that had been made in him by effort and patience, and this strange combination of mercy and theft. If he was to be cut into, it would be by a blade without a handle. He found himself on the bathroom floor one evening with the small rug under his knees and his palms flat on the tile, like a man who has asked a question of a god and is waiting to see if he will be taken up on it. He had not intended to kneel. He had gone in to wash his hands before making tea. The face stilled as if it had been found out. He lifted his head and met his own eyes in the mirror and did not look away fast enough to keep pain from rising through him like heat from a burner you forgot was on. He looked down again. He stayed there and let the ache go through. When it had gone, it left a quiet like a cleaned table. The face whispered into that quiet a single phrase that used his name and the word for door, and then a new word that might have been a name for the place where a door opens to. He did not get up for a long time. He put the chair away. He put the mirror in its place. He washed the towel and folded it in the measured thirds Laney would have approved. He set the towel exactly on the bar and pressed its edge smooth. He laid his palm on his shoulder, and the face leaned into the contact like a person who wants to be known and is too proud to ask exactly. He understood then that he was not a man with a passenger anymore. He was a room. He was a hallway. He was a porch. He was a place a voice could stand and send itself somewhere. He went to the plant one more time without a reason stamped on paper. He walked along the fence where the weeds kept trying and saw a bird sitting on a post, doing what birds do when they have learned to trust a place for a minute. He went inside and found the corridor between the pump room and the office and walked it with his hand along the cinder block wall, fingertips catching grit, the way a child walks a hallway and counts doors. He stood at the clarifier and did not lean. He thought into the face under his skin of what he knew, the way the skim arm clicked once at a certain point in its circle, the specific tone of a bearing just before it fails, the mistake new men make when they over-tighten a gasket because they are scared of being blamed for a drip. He offered these not as sacrifices, but as proof that he had paid attention to something in his life. The face listened. It needed him for this part. It needed someone to have stayed awake. He went home, The day slid by with as few edges as one of those clear plastics that comes wrapped around tools and cannot be opened without a knife. He waited for himself to act and watched himself not act. He boiled water and poured it and watched the steam draw lines on air that could have been writing. He sat with his back turned wrong for comfort to let the face be right, and did not call that a kindness, because that would have made it small. He said once and barely, "All right." The voice answered with a low yes that was more breath than letter, and that sounded like the thing a person says to himself in a mirror when his tie is crooked. Morning took its time arriving, and then arrived at last. He made coffee and left it on the counter. He stood at the sink and did not lift the cup. He walked to the bathroom and turned the light on, and it hummed and steadied, and he appreciated it for that. He stepped close to the mirror and turned partly away from himself so that his shoulder took up the glass. He spoke to the face without speaking. It understood. He angled himself the way it liked, a fraction this way, a fraction that. The mirror held him and the face and the room in its simple offering. The skin at the hollows waited. He put his palm there because that had become the sign they used for together. The face said his name in the tone of a person at a train station who is not asking anything, only identifying and saying, "I am here." He took the mirror off the wall again and set it flat, a lake where the sink was. He did it with a fluidity that surprised him, as if the action had been practiced and tucked away for a day like this. He filled the shallow he had made. He leaned. He touched the water with the face carefully. He did not press. He did not withdraw. He held himself where both his skin and the water could agree. The whisper rose through him and through the house and through the pipe under the sink and into the street and along the line to the corner and into the bigger line under the bigger street. It did not sound like a flood, and it did not sound like a speech. It sounded like what a city would sound like if you could hear it think about all the rooms where people had ever stood alone and listened to their refrigerators hum. He stayed and let that pass through and back. He stayed until he did not feel the ache of his bent knees. He stayed until the light outside the window had become the kind of pale that means a new day has accepted you, whether you ask to be accepted or not. He straightened then, slowly, because he had been holding a posture and a prayer without words at once. He put the mirror back and wiped the counter and hung the towel and checked the stove, even though he had not used the stove. He walked to the front room with his hands empty, which felt foreign. He sat in the chair and did not put the blanket over his shoulders. The refrigerator hummed and the heater clicked and the house wore its chores like medals. The knock came again. He recognized the way people knock when they know you are home and want you to choose. He did not rise. After a while, the footsteps turned away. His name came through the door and into the living room, the old nickname sewn to it. The face on his back listened to it as if it were a radio station from far away and beautiful because of its distance. He might have answered if words had not seemed suddenly like a wrong kind of tool. He breathed instead, a clear, steady measure that a person listening outside a door could have mistaken for sleep. When the house was quiet again, when the street did not ask him any more questions, he did a dangerous and ordinary thing without deciding to do it. He closed his eyes. He listened, not for a sound, but for the lack of one. He found a space within the regular breath of the refrigerator and the conservative ticks of the clock and the moderate personality of the heater, and he sat in that space as a man sits in a pew after everyone else has shaken hands and left. The face used his stillness and spoke one word, square and soft. He felt it shape the word not only with the mouth pressed under his skin, but with the whole warm weight of what it was in him. The word had more kinds of quiet inside it than he had ever thought a word could carry. It was either goodbye or it was hello. He could not tell, and found that to his surprise he did not need to. He sat listening until the light on the wall walked up and off the framed picture of the lake he had never seen, and onto the plain paint he had chosen because it was cheaper and did not ask for an opinion. The house hummed its tireless song. The face leaned where it liked and made a small, contented sound that did not require a reply. He did not move. He did not reach for anything. He did not need to be a man doing a thing. He was a room where a voice could be, and it was, and there was nothing to add. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.